Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. I should say welcome back because we took January off after a busy 2022. We hit a major milestone in December, posting our 300th episode, which is pretty exciting for us. So for those of you who've listened to all 300 episodes, which I'm sure there are many, many of you, thank you for sticking with us. But now we're rested and re-energized and planning another full year of deep dives into scholarly research and academic library trends and perspectives. Kicking it all off is a discussion with Dr. Sarah Derbew. Sarah is assistant professor of classics at Stanford University, where she focuses on ancient Greece's literature and art, and specifically how Black people are depicted in those works. She is also the author of the recent book published by Cambridge University Press called Untangling, Blackness in Greek Antiquity, which examines literary and artistic representations of Black Egyptians, Ethiopians, Indians, and Greeks in the Greek world. In her introduction, Sarah describes the book as being influenced by performance studies and critical race theory, which, quote, maps out an archaeology of Blackness that rejects simplistic conflations. It's an anti-racist study that, quote, promotes a contextualized critical approach to representations of Black people in Greek antiquity. Importantly, she takes great pains to separate her research from the modern influences on language, race, and skin color. It arrives in the midst of significant debate around classical studies, particularly the discipline's westernized and white perspective, interdisciplinary shortcomings, and its myopic focus on Greece and Rome. It boils down to this. If you're in a profession that needs to know how a major academic discipline, such as classical studies, is evolving in contemporary society, then this is a book for you. And I'm looking at you, the librarian who's trying to fill out a diversified collection, and you, the classic scholar who's continually wondering what lies beyond the borders of Greece, Rome, and Egypt. In his review of Untangling, Blackness in Greek Antiquity in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Naji Olya declares it is, quote, proof that the future of classics is already here. It's simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. In this first episode of this two-part series, which I'm proud to say is fully produced, including the questions by my colleague and Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, we're introduced to Sarah, her research, and her approach to writing her book. Okay, welcome to the program, Sarah.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
Sure. So why don't we start with an introduction, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your area of study and recent book. For example, how did your research focus lead to Untangling Blackness in Greek Antiquity?
Sure. My name is Sarah Derbew, and I'm currently an assistant professor of classics at Stanford University. I'm affiliated with the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity and the Center for African Studies here. And in general, my research examines representations of Blackness, of Black people in literature that was written 2,500 years ago. The language I focus on is ancient Greek literature, ancient Greek texts. And so in my work, I've been able to explore the ways that different writers, from historians to tragedians to satirists, are writing about, sometimes imagining, sometimes really recording their interactions with Black people. And I've also delved into the art world, thinking about the ways in which Black people were depicted in ancient Greek art and art from 2,500 years ago, some of which I discuss in my recent book, Untangling Blackness in Greek Antiquity. My research focus was not always on Blackness in Greek antiquity in the field of classics. As I think a lot of people know, language study is always the way to get in. I began studying Latin and Greek. Latin, I started when I was in junior high school. Greek, I picked up in college, but I really enjoyed languages, especially languages that are not currently spoken, because of the ways in which you can really look at all of the different angles of it. And it's a bit more stable than a spoken language that's constantly shifting depending on who's speaking it. And it shifts in very beautiful ways, but I find it harder to learn modern languages than ancient ones. But that being said, I have started engaging with modern languages more and more in my own work. But in this current book project, I really wanted to think about the ways in which ancient Greek texts ancient Greek writers were looking at Blackness, and from there, really think about more broad conversations that can be had about the intersection between African studies and the world of ancient Greece and Rome.
Excellent. Yeah, I think we'll certainly get a little bit more into, the way you parse and dissect aspects of language in your book, and why it's important that you sort of upfront, talk about certain terms that you use and why you use them. But also in the book, you cite a quote from historian and classicist Frank Snowden Jr., who said that scholars, quote, have regarded the black man of antiquity as a kind of Ralph Ellisonian invisible man. They have refused to see him, end quote. Can you talk more about how classicists have historically approached ancient depictions of blackness? How do these misappropriations continue to affect the study of classics today?
Thank you for this question, Bill, and for the careful reading of my book. You've introduced a quote that's very layered because of the ways that Frank Snowden, someone who was a 20th century classicist, an African American, someone who was at the forefront of his field, but because research institutions did not want to hire Black scholars at that time, he graduated from Harvard and taught at Howard University, a historically Black college, for most of his career, but writes in his memoir that he wanted to teach at the bigger schools that had more funding. And I think that was what would have really turned his career, not turned it around because he did phenomenal things, but would have given him more resources. But I mention all of this to say that his historicizing is really important, thinking about both the ways in which he's such a giant in terms of thinking about Blackness in the ancient Greek and Roman world, but
Hmm.
also someone who lived his experiences as an African American man growing up, having written literature from as early as 1947, right after World War II, all the way through to a posthumous piece in 2010. So, someone who really spans a huge time period. In terms of the quote that he used, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, this novel is really a prominent one in American literature, or at least it should be. And the story of this unnamed narrator who is invisible, living underneath the layers of a city, someone who has no name, no identity, but allusions to the Odyssey poke out and poke through the text. It's a way to really encapsulate how African American literature and ancient Greek literature are constantly speaking to each other and across each other, but we don't always give it that freedom when we're in the modern classroom or in modern academic spaces. So the quote does so much, even on its own, not even thinking about the content of it. But now diving into the content of An Invisible Man, I will say that Frank Snowden Jr. was someone who really pushed for examining representations of Black people in ancient Greek and ancient Latin literature. I don't agree with all of his conclusions, but he definitely put these communities on the map in ways that previously they had only been regarded in very grotesque, stereotypical terms. I'm thinking in particular of Grace Hadley Beardley's 1929, The Negro in Greek and Roman Civilization, which was a publication that preceded Snowden that he really fought against.
Hmm.
So these are all the intellectual, maybe forefathers, foremothers who I speak either with or against. And I find that the ways in which Snowden is engaging with the invisible man, the invisible forms of Blackness, is really inspiring for me so that I can dedicate even more energy and say, someone has done this before, but I want to build on their work. In terms of the second part of your question about how misappropriations continue to affect the study of classics today, the trope that I push against the most is the trope that somehow Blackness or Black skin color has always perpetually been connected with, imbued with this sense of inferiority. And I find that if people in any discipline are not careful to remember that the ways in which we associate particular skin colors and power dynamics as being fixed is very modern, at least from the last 500 years. If we're not careful, then we end up retrojecting that into the past and assuming that the way things are now are the way things were then in terms of skin color. And that does a lot of intellectual damage. It does a lot of damage to students who are coming in trying to find ways to see a different world in the material they're reading. And it also reinforces this sense of skin color always being struck with power dynamics, I can end up fueling actually people who think very negatively of communities who don't look like them, people who are
Mm,
in power. So I'm thinking about the ways in which white supremacists or the alt-right can use some of this material if we're not really careful about historicizing the ways in which we think about Blackness in the ancient world, and if we also don't emphasize the ways that whiteness did not exist in the ancient Greek world, because whiteness is very much a modern construct that only really tends to start cropping up once we have Black be a very color coded and power coded label that European enslavers made in the 15th century onward.
yeah, excellent. Um, so, in your book, Untangling Blackness in Greek Antiquity, you make the distinction between black with a lowercase b and black with an uppercase b. Broadly speaking, the lowercase black refers to ancient depictions of people with black skin and other phenotypic features, while the uppercase version speaks to a quote modern socially constructed group of people whose melanin is merely one of its distinguishing traits end quote. Can you talk about this distinction and why you made it and why was this differentiation necessary when writing your book?
Thanks for this as well, Bill. This ties into what I was just saying a bit
Yeah,
in terms of really wanting to let the past remain in the past as much as we can, recognizing that we're living in the present, but really wanting to use words that have context in their own time period and not trying to somehow map it as a one-to-one corollary with the
right.
present. So these words, the vocabulary here, the entire note on nomenclature, and the table at the beginning of my book in
Hmm.
the front matter was a way to show the readers my own grappling with this language, trying to figure out how do we find a term that can help to encapsulate some of what I'm describing. People whose skin color is dark brown, but whose skin color does not mean that they somehow lived in Memphis in 1960 or in America in New York in 1980s. So I was looking for words that would make sense, that would allude to the ways in which we think about skin color today, but not have a one-to-one correlation. The most simple way that I try to explain this language when I'm giving talks, and it's easier when people can see me, is to say black with a lowercase b is what my hair color is, and black with an uppercase b is what my skin color is. And I usually will point to one or the other to really help people understand how we've morphed language, we've morphed skin color in ways that don't always even correlate to what the actual color looks like, but it becomes a more socially constructed marker.
Hmm.
So I use examples like this to point out to communities that as much as we want to maybe see ourselves and ourselves being Black people with an uppercase B in the ancient world, in ancient Greece, it is not that desire. And there were people who had skin color that would be described as uppercase B in the past, but that desire may also be coming from a sense of wanting equality, wanting to think about a time when skin color did not determine people's standing in life the way that it does today. And what I do with the different languages really show that the ways in which we stratify communities based on skin color was not that strict in antiquity. They definitely had ways to say you have more power and you have less, but it could be something that was not even based on how you look. It could
Right.
be the language that you spoke, it could be the clothes that you wore, it could be your citizenship status. So part of my uppercase B, lowercase b is to recognize that there are ways in which skin color existed in the past, skin color that we would call Black, but it didn't have all of the historical ramifications that the term has today.
Hmm. Excellent. Perfect. So you make several other important distinctions in the book, such as between modern and ancient depictions of race. Again, you've talked about this a little bit. Why is it so important to differentiate between modern and ancient interpretations? How can modern understandings of socially constructed terms impact our views of ancient art, stories, and civilizations?
hmm My fear is that if we speak about race and racism, the modern, more modern constructs, and we use that same language to talk about the past, and we say there was race or racism in the past, then if we're not careful, we can draw a line between the two, and it can almost seem that racism is this inevitable trait, and Blackness being always treated as the inferior group has always existed throughout time. And that's something I want to push back against
Mm,
because it's very dangerous to assume that somehow the hierarchy that we've created has always been the same, and that the same people have always been at the top and the same people at the bottom. So I distinguish between race and modern race, or thinking about race more broadly in antiquity, as a way to free us from just applying the modern lens to the past, and to
Mm,
really think about in what other ways can we imagine group stratification or power dynamics, if not through the lens of race? Could it be through the lens of some of the other things I've mentioned, language? Could it be through the lens of hair color? Could it be through the lens of whether or not you wear earrings or ornaments, or if you have
right.
tattoos? All of these different ways, some of which are visual, some of which are not. But if we free ourselves from the confines of race only as skin color, then it can help us think about the pluralities of different communities, and perhaps even the pluralities of communities in the 21st century as well, to really free race from needing to be somehow confined to only the ways in which melanin has affected people's skin color.
Hmm. Yeah, I imagine that kind of isolates or helps to sort of focus on, when you're looking at the classic literature, art, that you're kind of just getting rid of all of the modern structures around language and everything, and around and history, and just kind of looking at the thing for what it is, and being able to examine the context of it without, as you say, our modern interpretations or hangups.
And we do try our best. What's difficult is that you can never not see the world through your own perspective. And what I try to do in my work is say I'm going to embrace the fact that I do have a particular perspective growing up in New York City as
Right.
an Ethiopian American person. But leaning into that, I think, is more academically honest than pretending that
Mm.
somehow I have an objective perspective because I've been studying these languages for so long, or because I've gone to school where I've had to really engage with some of these ideas. So I do find that being very straightforward about having a lens and saying that this is the lens I have, and you can now engage with the material and come to your own conclusions as well, is what I tried to address in the book. So, in the introduction, I mentioned that my vocabulary is a work in progress, and I state that this is not a sign of academic laziness, but instead
Yeah.
academic integrity and generosity to say, I hope in 10 years someone will find language or frameworks that make more sense, and maybe that can only happen because of the lived experiences that they have and the sensitivities that they have that maybe I do not have. So I do see this as an ongoing project, really thinking about what language to use and what perspectives to bring to the fore that haven't been introduced before.
Right. Yeah, and I think that reminds me also in somewhere in the introduction. Forgive me, I can't remember who you were quoting, but there was another researcher that you brought up, who, I'm paraphrasing terribly, but mentioned that it there's a subjective nature to all of this too. Like, the way a reader or an historian might interpret things. You can't there's this sort of inability to define things, because people kind of bring to it what they do, and they'll interpret it in their own ways.
And the most that we can do as people who only live in one body is to be as responsible and as upfront as we can be.
Yeah.
I do find that the beauty of at least the humanities is that you don't have to give the answer. You're just giving a potential thought to chew on, or maybe another question, but it's really about giving serious thought to ideas, which
Mm.
is very freeing because I'm not trying to find a cure for a disease. It's not a straightforward, you put in this molecule and this comes out, but it's more really thinking about how to do ethical, rigorous work for communities that maybe don't always appear in the classroom if you were to study Greek, Latin studies, classics, ancient Mediterranean studies.
Right. Right. So, you also describe your book as an anti-racist study. How does this approach inform your research, and especially when working within the classics?
I try to always center whoever I think is a marginalized group as a way to pay respect to these communities, but to
Mm.
also say that just because they've been marginalized today doesn't mean that they always were.
Yeah.
And if anything, this reflects maybe more modern biases or the modern impulse to look away when something shows up in sources that you don't think is relevant, or maybe does not seem as exciting. So I do try to infuse a lot of my work with really thinking about who would I have wanted to see as a student in some of the texts that I'm reading, or who do I think deserves more attention? So I do have a very underdog focused approach when I'm trying to think about what my new research topic will be.
Hmm.
But I also emphasize that these are not communities that are unimportant. These are just communities that in the present day have not gotten the attention that they deserve. And I try to balance that scale to tip it a little bit so that we can apply some of the resources and time and care we give to the more monumentalized or more popularly known communities, and to take some of that care and attention and share it with others. I also have found pleasantly that students, graduate students, have really taken to the phrase anti-racist, because they'll tell me in an interview I did with Laila Balarao for the Society of Classical Studies recently, she was saying that it was a really heartening note that helped to indicate that this is a book that's going to be very caring about Blackness. And so I think that it's a useful signal that I hadn't intended to those who are in the field of classics and are looking for ethical, equitable ways to engage with communities that are not always front and center in the field.
Yeah, that's great. So at the end of each of your chapters, you include an example of modern depictions of Blackness, drawing connections between the ancient and the contemporary. Can you talk about the purpose of this practice and these connections, and can maybe talk about one of those examples?
Hmm. I wanted to acknowledge all of the other fields, disciplines, scholars who have influenced my work and who have helped me do a lot of really powerful formative thinking. So I
Mhm.
turned to Paul Beatty, to Sadia Hartman, to Pauline Hopkins to really recognize publicly the ways in which these scholars have helped form my own thinking, and to show that there are some fields that have really pushed forward the ways in which we think about Blackness with a lowercase b and an uppercase b that we can look to for more formative connections and formative pathways. In one of the later chapters, I examined the 4th century CE Greek novel, rather the 4th century novel written in Greek, and I talk a bit about why I don't call it a Greek novel in chapter 6. But I look at a novel about Chariclea. She's a princess from Ethiopia, from modern day Sudan or Egypt, who is at odds with her skin color because her skin color is white, and her parents' skin color, they're the king and the queen of the region, their skin color is black. Because of her skin color, she's not able to live in her hometown, ends up traveling. She thinks she's Greek, ends up finally coming back home and reuniting with her parents. But when I read this novel, I couldn't stop thinking about the modern trope of passing and the ways in which being able to pass as a different group than the group that you're born into is something that resonates deeply in the African American culture. So I started reading Nella Larsen's Passing and Jesse Redmond Fawcett's text as well. And I came across a novel by Pauline Hopkins. This was published 1902, 1903, a serialized novel called Of One Blood that follows a man who eventually goes on a journey to Nubia, to this region that Chariclea is from, but someone who's also grappling with the trope of not knowing his parentage. Other characters as well show up there, not knowing their parentage. Whiteness and blackness have a very complicated relationship. And I thought bringing this modern novel into conversation with an ancient novel was really useful for parsing through some of the bigger questions about identity, about passing, about skin color, about claims to royal lineage. So these sorts of connections, I really want to push the field of classics to make, to really have rigorous connections with African and African American studies. And I felt because I'm publishing a book that will be probably read more in the field of classics than in other fields, this could be a way to infuse my own field with a bit more nuance when it comes to thinking about Blackness, and also with a bit more of an expansive perspective when it comes to thinking about who's considered an allied discipline when we think of this field.
You just heard from Dr. Sarah Derbew, Assistant Professor of Classics at Stanford University, where she is affiliated with the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity and the Center for African Studies. She is also the author of the book Untangling Blackness in Greek Antiquity, published by Cambridge University Press. Join us next week when we address the evolution of classical studies, including why more equity in research perspectives is needed.
Something a colleague in my department told me that I really liked is rising tides lift all ships. And this is the mindset that I have, really thinking about the next generation of classicists and what the field of classics will look like in 10, 20, 50 years. I do find that there are so many other fields that have engaged critically with thinking about race beyond skin color or skin color itself. And classics has not done that yet as a field. Because humanities is so porous in terms of disciplinary formations and also disciplinary boundaries, I find that it makes the most sense to me to benefit from all of the work that other people have done, rather than try to create my own framework only using particular scholars because that's all that I'm told that I can use.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.